3 years before her tragic death, Elizabeth Montgomery revealed the jaw-dropping truth about Bewitched, and it made audiences see the show in a whole new light. But more on this later. Elizabeth Montgomery was born in Los Angeles, California, the buzzing entertainment capital of the world. She also had two show business parents. Her mother was a Broadway actress from Kentucky, and her father was Robert Montgomery, a New Yorker and Academy Award nominee. Once Montgomery had finished acting school, she wanted to get down to work. She already majorly disappointed her parents by throwing herself into show business, but now she needed a big favor from her father. Montgomery hoped to land a spot on her father's TV series, Robert Montgomery Presents. Though reluctant, he allowed her to have her debut on his show, but he still wasn't happy about putting his daughter into the world of celebrity. Unfortunately, their poor relationship would lead to some of Elizabeth Montgomery's unfortunate daddy issues. Montgomery's fear and devotion toward her father affected more than just her career. It also bled into her love life in increasingly disturbing ways. In 1954, she married Frederick Hammond, a rich, well-connected socialite who had nothing to do with show business and was sure to finally earn her father's support. The fact that Cameron was a decade older than her and could almost be her father wasn't creepy at all, right? Sadly, this was only but the beginning. When Elizabeth Montgomery starred in her first Hollywood film opposite to heartthrob Gary Cooper, it turned into a disaster for her personal life. After all, despite the fact she was still married to Cameron, Cooper was her kryptonite, a dashing older man. Before long, Montgomery and Cooper were reportedly hot and heavy with each other, but these carefree decisions had massive consequences. As you might have guessed from her jumping right into bed with her very first Hollywood co-star, Montgomery was miserable at home. Turned out, her older husband Cameron also wanted her to quit acting and stay home all day to take care of the household. This was definitely not what she signed up for, and the writing was on the wall. Within a year, the marriage was over. Now that she was a free woman, she ramped her life right up. While working on 1963's thriller Johnny Cool, Montgomery solidified her reputation as an actress who met her boyfriends at work. In the film, she played a socialite who falls for a gang member. As it turns out, Montgomery also fell for someone else, the director. So, had she learned her lesson about dating older men? Not a chance. William Asher was more than a decade older than her. Not only was her new beau older, Montgomery wasn't safe with Asher. In fact, her very life was in danger. Nonetheless, she married Asher in 1963 anyways. The two had planned to sell themselves as a show business duo and quickly stumbled upon a comedic series that caught their eye. The story was about a modern-day witch and her hilarious relationship with her very mortal husband. Of course, this was about Bewitched, and it was about to be one serious game changer for Montgomery. However, though it sounded like the perfect project, it certainly got off to a grisly start. Montgomery was now in her dream role playing the lovable Samantha Stevens on Bewitched. The dream, however, was about to become a nightmare. You see, Montgomery and her husband, the director, had done something to sabotage the making of Bewitched. They'd gotten pregnant. They were still filming season 1, and Montgomery was very clearly showing her baby bump. Nothing short of a miracle could save the filming of Bewitched. Montgomery was likely anticipating the arrival of her first child, but the producers on Bewitched were pulling their hair out, trying to figure out what to do. There were no miracles to cover up Montgomery's expanding pregnant body. There was, however, ways to cheat. The plan was to film all of these scenes that didn't have Montgomery in them, which were a few. After Montgomery gave birth, she quickly filmed her scenes, and the show would get its premiere. When Bewitched finally hit television screens, Montgomery completely bedazzled audiences. The producers thought it would be fun to give them even more of Montgomery. Enter Serena, Samantha Stevens' free-spirited and provocatively dressed cousin. Fans loved her, and so did someone else. Crew members reported seeing something odd. Montgomery still in her Serena outfit, and her husband heading to a motel for some behind-the-scenes fun. Montgomery's real-life husband seemed to have it all. Her on-screen husband, however, had nothing but problems. When the actor playing her husband, Dick York, came down with severe back pain, Montgomery let the writers deal with it. And what was their not-so-clever solution? In all of his scenes, husband Darren was either on the couch, in bed, or out of town. York's back pain soon became crippling, and his solution was even worse. Dick York had turned to medication to deal with his chronic pain, but tragically, this progressed into something worse: on-set drinking. Well, in the middle of a scene, Montgomery suddenly noticed that York was tipsy. It seemed that Dick York's personal troubles couldn't get any worse, but they did. Montgomery was now dealing with a very distraught co-star, whose pain and drinking deeply affected his ability to perform. That's when York announced his third complication. He was in love with Montgomery. Now remember, it was Montgomery's husband who was sitting just over yonder in the director's chair. The set of Bewitched had suddenly become a very complicated place. Something had to give, or someone had to go. Montgomery had pretty much had it with York. His back pain, his drinking, and his so-called love for her. She just wanted him to go work and get the job done. While filming a scene for the 5th season, York collapsed on set. That was the last straw, and the production replaced him with Dick Sargent. When it came down to it, Montgomery didn't really care who played her husband. However, when they replaced the director, that's when the real trouble began. The man in the director's chair on Bewitched was Montgomery's husband. But when guest director Richard Michaels stepped in, he took on 2 roles: TV show director and, shocker alert, lover of the lead actor. Montgomery started an affair with Michaels, and on a small set like Bewitched, it was going to be next to impossible to keep it a secret. The affair between Montgomery and Michaels crashed and burned in a spectacular way. Both Montgomery's husband and Michael's wife found out about the affair, and both tried to pick up the pieces of their marriage broken by cheating. Even though they tried their hardest, neither couple was able to survive. In fact, the 2 marriages ended within a year of each other. Morale on the show was at an all-time low, but what would the repercussions be? Elizabeth Montgomery was no different than most stars on long-term TV series. She was feeling bored and looking for a way out. When she hinted to producers that maybe her time on Bewitched was up, she didn't get sympathy or a pep talk. She got money thrown at her. Montgomery continued for a few seasons just for the cash, and then, in season 8, she said stop. Her marriage to the director was over, and she saw no reason to keep playing a character she'd grown tired of. She quit the series that had been her bread and butter for almost a decade. She was finally a free woman. Montgomery began to take roles that helped audiences forget about her Bewitched role, and she signed up for 1977's A Killing Affair. Here, Montgomery plays an officer who begins to have romantic feelings for her partner. So what's the controversy in that? Well, in 1977, the fact that her love interest was black was still quite the taboo. But hold on to your horses. There was something else about this film, something that could have cost Montgomery her life. The real danger on A Killing Affair was Montgomery's co-star. It was none other than O.J. Simpson. Of course, Simpson would later get into huge trouble when authorities charged him with the murder of his ex-wife and her boyfriend. Let's just say Montgomery was more than a little lucky she didn't pick up a boyfriend on this film. Montgomery had certainly come a long way from playing housewife Samantha Stevens, but not so far that she couldn't go back. One thing is pretty clear, Montgomery wasn't the most faithful spouse. This didn't mean, however, she didn't care for things like freedom and equality outside her house. Even back in the 1970s, she became a fiery critic of her government. She saw that young men were giving up their lives for a battle that she thought was meaningless. This, of course, was the Vietnam War, and Montgomery risked losing fans by speaking out against her country's involvement. Yes, Vietnam made Montgomery angry, but she was even angrier about something happening in the good old USA. Another fire under Montgomery's belly was the equal rights for women movement. Montgomery looked around and saw that men and women were not equal, and she wanted to do something about it. However, many people thought she had already contributed to the movement. In fact, many people thought that the character of Samantha helped push women's rights forward. How? Clearly, the power balance of her on-screen marriage tilted very squarely in her direction. The New York Times went a step further and said that Samantha was a hopeful role model for a changing society. There was, however, something sneaky Montgomery had done on Bewitched. It was a not-so-subtle appeal for gender equality. By the end of Bewitched, Elizabeth Montgomery was itching to become political but was feeling bound by playing Samantha Stevens. When she wanted to express her support for the women's liberation movement, she did something incredibly sneaky. You see, women across America were showing their anger by burning their bras. So what did Montgomery do? She took hers off and refused to wear it while filming. But that wasn't all. Remember, there were two Dicks on Bewitched, Dick York and Dick Sargent. As it turned out, the second one just so happened to be gay. Montgomery wanted to support her TV husband, so she dove into the gay rights movement. She and Sargent were the grand marshals of the Gay Pride Parade in LA in 1992. But besides her TV husband, there was much more going on behind the scenes of Bewitched. Montgomery later admitted that Bewitched was subtext for repression in general. The show was about a woman who couldn't be her real self. In fact, the very thing she was something she had to hide. And remember, back when they were making Bewitched, being gay was against the law. You could even be behind bars for it. Could it be that being a witch was a metaphor for being gay? In a way, that metaphor kind of works. There was, however, something else gay about Bewitched. Almost everyone involved. Paul Lynde, who had 10 episodes as Uncle Arthur, eventually came out of the closet. The man who played Samantha's father, Maurice Evans, was reportedly gay. Additionally, some rumors suggested that the actress who played Samantha's mother, Agnes Moorehead, was a lesbian. Some people called it the gayest cast in TV history. Montgomery had surrounded herself with a queer community, so when a national health tragedy struck, she stepped up. In the 1980s, Montgomery witnessed a dark cloud over America. This was the AIDS crisis, and she saw many of her gay friends suffering. Of course, the always political Montgomery was there to stand on the right side of history. In fact, she was one of the first celebrities to show their support. She was incredibly brave, but sadly, she'd soon need this courage for her own health crisis. It turned out that Montgomery had something terrible, cancer. Unfortunately, before long, the cancer had already advanced and it was terminal. Only 8 weeks after her diagnosis,